We all have the ability to transform ourselves in one way or another. But first, you have to be willing to venture into the unfamiliar. And to get there, it usually requires having to step past certain boundaries, boundaries that you think exist. I'm not going to tell you about the work that I do as a photographer necessarily, but I want to speak a little bit about my personal journey, my process, and some of the things I've uncovered as a result of this. When I was 14, I lost something that at the time I didn't realize would impact my life and my identity in such a tremendous way. I started to lose my hair to a condition called alopecia. And for those of you that might not be familiar, it's an autoimmune disease where your body basically thinks that your hair is an enemy and it attacks it so it doesn't grow. You could imagine how traumatic that was at that age. To lose something so familiar and so definitive of this idea of femininity. And of course, what is expected of a young, normal, healthy girl at that age. Ironically, the most harmful thing about the condition wasn't from the actual condition itself, but from my encounters with other people. I was heckled throughout my adolescence and pretty much right into adulthood. And I was made to feel ashamed for being visibly different from other girls. This forcibly pushed me outside of that boundary of what was considered normal, for something I had absolutely no control over. Of course, my life wasn't all bad. I was lucky to grow up in St. Vincent. I lived near the beach. I had a great group of friends. And my parents had all both recognized a certain, creative impulses in me from a young age. And my dad did his best to nurture this out of me. And it was through that nurturing that I had gradually found my way working in photography. I taught myself how to use a camera, and I just exposed myself to as many things as possible. And I was able to figure out how to redirect all of that frustration I was feeling at the time and express myself in ways that I couldn't articulate with words. And that boundary that I felt originally closing in was beginning to expand again because I had basically figured out how to use my imagination to escape. I became really interested in trying to document my everyday experiences. At the time, a lot of the imagery I was being exposed to, they were much more commercial, they were very tourist-centric. And they didn't feel like an authentic representation of the Caribbean island that I grew up on, and the reality that I was actually living at that time. And I sort of made it my agenda to make images that counted that somehow. And my work ended up taking on a very cinematic tone to create this feeling of imminence, as though something was always on the edge of happening. And out of that emerged a type of aesthetic where you could say it was a little bit dark, but I wanted to figure out somehow to translate those emotions into the work, to create this tense feeling. And even with that, I tried to put something familiar in it, something that could connect people. I think when we see something familiar of ourselves in the image, it becomes much easier for us to connect to that thing. And then that really does open up a lot of possibilities. This is an image I did in 2004 called The Garden. And it's a photograph of my grandmother and my great-aunt sharing a bed together. There was a very familiar sensibility in this, I think, to a lot of Caribbean people. Very stereotypical floral bed sheets, type of body language that exists between the women. But the thing that resonates to me about this image is that there's an unspoken boundary between them. They're facing away from each other. And a lot of my earlier work tries to investigate this kind of tension, whether it's between subjects or between myself and a subject. I think there's value in going into these uncomfortable places. And at the time, I understood that even if it was within my own home, I had to step past certain boundaries to get there. Because it was helping me to redefine a lot of the attitudes I had towards myself and towards my environment at the time. Boundaries exist everywhere. Whether it's in our personal lives, the types of relationships we have with each other, and even in a more abstract sense, even in photographs. When I was learning to compose an image for the first time, one of the things that pretty much occurred to me was that photography is not just about what you put within an image, but also what you choose to leave out of that frame. And when I understood that, it really created a solid foundation how I approach a lot of my images to date and how people can interpret things. So when you think about it, even within a photograph, there's a boundary. That frame of an image is the boundary. And what we should be considering when we look at a photograph is not just what we see within that frame, but everything that isn't there. So when you think about it, it's very similar to living on an island. We're aware of only so much. But when you step to that boundary's edge, that shoreline, and you can look out towards the horizon, even though you might not necessarily be aware of everything beyond a certain point, there is that feeling of hopefulness, of possibility, of room for your imagination to wander. And I think it's the same thing with images. There should be room beyond that frame for your imagination to go somewhere. There's a quote that I really like by Christopher Cozier, a Trinidadian artist. And he said, "An island is a place from which people look out." And I know it seems like a really simplistic statement to make, but the thing that resonates to me about it is that it does speak to this notion of a boundary, or a point in which you feel as though you can't go any further. But it's really that awareness of the shoreline that provokes this idea of our limitations. Who can we become beyond that boundary of the shoreline? Recently, my work has actually taken me into the sea, so beyond that boundary. And I like to think of what I'm doing as looking back at an island, but from a different vantage point, trying to gain a deeper understanding of myself, of ourselves. And I think I'm still very much trying to search for that familiar thing, that universal thing that connects all of us. But I'm doing it in an even more unfamiliar space. I started this series in 2015 called Circa No Future. And it really became a turning point in the imagery I was doing, because prior to that, especially with my underwater work, I was just experimenting and observing and, with all sorts of random things. But it was really the first time I introduced that human element into the work. And more specifically, observing people past that boundary of that shoreline and how they fell into more comfortable ways of being themselves, more vulnerable ways. Now, this work looks at a very typical or very familiar scene I think a lot of us are accustomed to seeing at the beach, with these young black adolescent boys jumping off of boats or rocks or jetties. But it's focused on a very specific moment that happens. I think we're all accustomed to seeing that moment above water where they're very hyper-masculine and there's a performance or they're showing off. But there's a point where they break through that surface and they seem to be suspended in this state of vulnerability. That vulnerability really interests me because it's a group of familiar guys acting in this very unfamiliar way. You could say that on this surface, I have nothing in common with these boys, in a very superficial way. But losing my hair actually gave me this strange access to these moments. Because from a distance, these boys would assume that I was a boy as well, swimming up to them, because they were only seeing the top of my head in the water. And what that actually gave me was like a very temporary glimpse into a whole other world. I noticed a type of sensitivity and camaraderie that they were expressing amongst each other. And it's something you don't get to see typically as a woman, especially on land, because teenage boys can always be so guarded. Of course, that moment that they realized I was a woman, the dynamic completely changed, and they felt betrayed, and then they went into performance again. But my objective was always to try and capture that moment of vulnerability. And one of the great things about photography is that you are able to sort of freeze these moments. You're able to slow down a sequence and make these invisible moments visible. So I started documenting them above the water and going right through the surface and sort of stumbled across this moment. And I spent some time trying to capture it. And what occurred to me was that their boundary was actually that surface of the water and everything above, everything back on land. Those constructs that they were battling with before did not exist in that space. And I think there's something there to take notice of. I think it's really fascinating that we are surrounded by all of this water. Yet due to the physical limitations of our humanness, of our bodies, we can't really completely occupy that space. But there is a sort of temporary ideal of who we can become in the sea, even if it's for a brief moment. So if we don't belong there and we belong here, how can we take that temporary experience and apply it to our societies and land to make ourselves more emotionally vulnerable, more understanding, tolerant, compassionate? Coming out of that experience with these boys, one of the big questions I really started to ask myself was, is it possible for us to view ourselves void of these social constructs that create these boundaries between us and within us? Is there a way for us to dissolve this construct of gender, class, race, sexuality, country of origin, whatever? And what occurred to me was that people were the ones that created these boundaries. The sea has no agenda. Rich or poor, it will swallow you. So in a sense, when you think about it, the ocean really is the one true democratic space that exists. And as Caribbean islands, we are surrounded by it. So it really is one of our greatest resources, not just from the obvious sustainable point of view, but the sort of social implications of what it could mean for us. This image is called Is That a Boy? And it's somewhat of a humorous title, and it is a bit of play on words. But there's a serious underlying discussion that it addresses. It references the idea of gender and sexuality, and the type of assumptions people can make based on physical attributes. Now, obviously, this is something very closely related to my own experiences growing up with alopecia. And more specifically, this image really came out, it was inspired by these boys and that initial interaction I had with them. It shows an image of my head on the left and a buoy or a boy on the right. And it's meant to make you look twice and question the validity of your own perceptions, what you think you see versus the actual reality of a situation. So just like you might go to the beach and see a buoy floating in the water and you could mistake it for a person swimming, there's a way that we can also objectify people based on a lack of adequate information or understanding. One of the great things about working with the sea is that it does have this way that it can render a body to seem very ambiguous. It does dissolve that construct of gender. I actually showed this piece earlier this year at the Jamaican Biennial, the National Gallery, and a critic did a review on all the work, and he spoke a little bit about this piece, and he kept on referring to the person in the image as a man. And that, to me, was just a testament of how successful the work actually was. Is it a man or a woman in the water? Does it matter? The boundary in this image actually lies between you, the viewer, and the image. It's within your own perceptions and what you're willing to accept as acceptable. I took a simple routine of just swimming daily, and I used photography to act as a witness to different experiences I was having in the sea. And I hope that people are somehow able to find something familiar of themselves in my work and connect to that. And maybe it will instill some sort of desire to step past your own boundaries. My photography has always been an exploration of my own humanity. And it's a very personal and very visceral response to the world that I live in. I'm not a scientist, and I don't try to make any assertions as a scientist. But what I have uncovered from these water explorations is that we all have the ability in one way or another to transform our thinking and the types of relationships we could have with each other. And it doesn't matter if you're the photographer, the subject, or the viewer. So ask yourself, where are your boundaries? And if you could step past those boundaries or jump past them or swim past them or whatever, and could look back at yourself, what would you see? Or who do you think you could become? Are you willing to venture into that unfamiliar territory and move past those boundaries that you think exist, whether they've been forced on you or they're a construct of your own mind or environment? I think there's somebody inside of all of us who's willing to take that jump. And this is actually what it looks like on the other side. Thank you.